it's just specialised with what this landscape has to offer, which is lots of ants and lots of termites. It's just perfect for it.
For decades, something was missing from Argentina's vast Iberá wetlands. After the region's largest predator vanished, capybara numbers exploded, vegetation suffered, and the balance that once shaped the ecosystem slowly unraveled. Then, an ambitious conservation effort attempted something many thought was impossible, bringing jaguars back after nearly 70 years. What followed transformed not only the fate of a powerful predator, but the future of an entire landscape. When the wetlands lost their greatest hunter. Long before jaguars returned to Argentina's Iberá wetlands, the region was already showing signs that something had gone terribly wrong. On the surface, the landscape still looked alive. Vast marshes stretched across the horizon, birds filled the skies, and wildlife remained abundant. But beneath that appearance of health, an invisible imbalance had been growing for decades. The turning point came when jaguars disappeared from the region. As the ecosystem's top predator, they had once helped regulate populations of herbivores and smaller animals. Without them, nature lost one of its most important controls. The effects were gradual at first, but over time, they became impossible to ignore. Among the biggest beneficiaries of the jaguar's absence were capybaras. These giant rodents, already well adapted to the wetlands, suddenly faced far fewer threats. Their numbers surged across Iberá, with enormous groups gathering near lakes, rivers, and marshes. Every day, each adult consumed several pounds of grasses and aquatic plants. Multiplied across thousands of animals, the impact became enormous. As grazing intensified, entire sections of vegetation struggled to recover. Tall grasses that once sheltered wildlife became shorter and thinner. Areas that had provided cover for nesting birds and insects slowly lost their protective layers. What seemed like a simple increase in one species was quietly reshaping the entire ecosystem. The problems did not stop with capybaras. Throughout the 20th century, hunting, livestock expansion, land clearing, and habitat degradation pushed many native species toward local extinction. Jaguars were not the only victims. Giant river otters, macaws, and peccaries also disappeared from parts of the region, leaving behind a far less diverse landscape. By the time jaguars vanished completely from Corrientes province during the 1930s and 1950s, Iberá had entered a new ecological reality. For nearly 70 years, no apex predator remained to keep the balance in check. Herbivore populations expanded, vegetation declined, and the natural relationships that once held the wetlands together became increasingly fragile. Scientists understood that restoring Iberá would require more than protecting land. The missing pieces of the ecosystem would somehow need to be returned. But bringing back a lost predator after decades of absence sounded almost impossible. Yet while many saw an unsolvable problem, two unlikely individuals were preparing a plan that would eventually change the future of Iberá forever. The outsiders who bought back the wild. Before Iberá's recovery became a global conservation success story, its future was already being rewritten by two unexpected individuals. Doug Tompkins had first made his mark in the business world, co-founding the North Face, and later expanding into Esprit during the 1970s and 1980s. At the time, he was part of the same consumer-driven system that shaped modern outdoor culture. But over the years, his perspective began to shift in a way that would eventually pull him completely out of that world. What once felt like achievement slowly turned into doubt. The more he participated in mass production and consumption, the more he saw its impact on the natural landscapes he loved. That internal conflict grew until he made a drastic decision that surprised many in the industry. He sold off most of his business interests and stepped away from corporate life entirely, choosing uncertainty over continued success. Christine Tompkins, who had served as CEO of Patagonia, was also moving in a similar direction. Instead of focusing on business growth, she began shifting her attention toward long-term ecological preservation. When she and Doug joined forces, their goal was no longer tied to profit or expansion, but to restoration on a scale few people had ever attempted. Their approach was unusual and, to many, hard to understand. Rather than investing in development or tourism projects, they began purchasing large areas of degraded land across Argentina and Chile. These were not pristine forests or protected reserves, but overgrazed ranches and damaged ecosystems that had lost much of their original life. Starting in the early 1990s, they quietly accumulated vast territories with a single idea in mind: allow nature to recover. As their land holdings expanded, so did public curiosity. Locals and observers questioned their intentions, unable to understand why so much money was being spent on seemingly unproductive land. Rumors spread quickly. Some suspected hidden commercial plans, while others feared outside control of large rural regions. The scale of their acquisitions even led some to describe their properties as a private kingdom, a label that reflected both suspicion and intrigue. Despite the doubts, they continued building what would become one of the most ambitious private conservation efforts in the world, eventually securing over 2 million acres. In Iberá alone, hundreds of thousands of acres were placed under restoration, laying the foundation for something far larger than anyone expected. But protecting land was only the beginning. Their real challenge was far more ambitious: rebuilding entire ecosystems and bringing back species that had been gone for decades. And at the center of that vision stood the most difficult return of all: the jaguar. The high-risk mission to restore the apex predator. Reintroducing jaguars into Iberá was never going to be as simple as releasing animals back into the wild. After nearly 70 years of absence, the ecosystem had changed. Human activity had expanded, and the jaguars themselves had to be carefully prepared for a landscape that no longer functioned the way it once did. This was not just a conservation effort. It was a controlled reconstruction of a lost predator's place in nature. To begin, conservation teams created a specialized breeding and training center on San Alonso Island, a remote and partially wild area deep within the wetlands. The location was chosen deliberately. It was isolated enough to reduce human interference, yet large enough to simulate natural conditions. Inside this controlled environment, jaguars would not simply be kept safe. They would have to relearn survival itself. Starting around 2015, jaguars from Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and rescue centers were brought into the program to increase genetic diversity. Argentina's wild population was only about 200, too small and genetically limited. Mixing lines helped avoid inbreeding and improve survival. Behavior was also crucial, minimizing human contact and encouraging natural hunting instincts with live prey like capybaras, wild pigs, and peccaries. Every movement was monitored with precision. GPS collars tracked their ranges and travel patterns, while camera traps captured detailed footage of hunting behavior, territorial activity, and social interactions. Researchers studied each individual closely, looking for signs that the animals were ready, or not ready, for eventual release. Jaguars that showed excessive human tolerance or weak hunting ability were kept back from reintroduction. Then came a breakthrough moment that shifted everything. In 2018, the first jaguar cubs born in Corrientes province in over 70 years entered the world. One of them, named Arami, meaning a piece of sky in the Guarani language, quickly became a symbol of hope for the entire project. Alongside key breeding individuals, these births proved that a self-sustaining population was finally possible again. By 2021, the program reached a critical milestone when jaguars were released into Iberá's wild landscapes for the first time in decades. At first, only a small number, around 8 individuals, roamed freely, but their presence marked a historic turning point. Still, uncertainty lingered. Farmers worried about livestock losses, local communities questioned the risks, and the fragile balance between humans and predators was suddenly under pressure again. What happened next would determine whether the return of the jaguar was a success, or another collapse waiting to happen. And as these apex predators stepped fully back into Iberá's swamps, the entire ecosystem began reacting in ways that scientists were only starting to understand. The return of fear to Iberá. The moment jaguars returned to Iberá, the wetlands didn't just gain a predator again. They gained pressure, tension, and an entirely new behavioral balance that had been missing for decades. Capybaras, which had long enjoyed unchecked freedom across the marshes, suddenly found themselves under constant threat. For years, they had moved in large groups, grazing openly and shaping the landscape without fear. That era was now starting to shift. Field observations and tracking data quickly confirmed what researchers suspected. Jaguars were actively hunting capybaras, along with other prey like wild pigs and peccaries. But the real transformation was not only in the number of animals taken, it was in the reaction of the survivors. Capybaras began avoiding open feeding areas, changing movement routes, and reducing the time they spent in exposed grasslands. This behavioral shift had immediate consequences for the ecosystem. Areas that had been heavily grazed for years started to recover. Vegetation grew taller, denser, and more complex again. Plants that had been suppressed by constant feeding pressure began to regenerate, slowly restoring the structure of the wetlands. Even without wiping out capybara populations, jaguars were already changing the way the entire system functioned. Ecologists often describe this kind of influence as a landscape of fear, where predators shape ecosystems not just through hunting, but through presence alone. In Iberá, that concept became visible in real time. The wetlands were no longer just a place of abundance for herbivores, they were once again a landscape of caution, movement, and survival strategy. As vegetation returned, other species began to feel the effects. Birds found safer nesting zones in the regrowing grasses. Insects regained shelter, and soil conditions improved as plant cover stabilized the ground. These cascading changes showed how a single predator could indirectly influence dozens of ecological processes at once. Still, this ecological recovery was not unfolding without tension. While scientists observed positive changes in biodiversity, local ranchers and landowners began expressing renewed concern. The return of jaguars raised difficult questions about livestock safety and long-term coexistence, especially in regions where cattle farming remained central to livelihoods. And beneath these growing tensions, a larger shift was beginning to form, one that would involve not just jaguars and capybaras, but entire communities forced to adapt to a rewired ecosystem. Because as Iberá started to heal, the real test was no longer only ecological. It was becoming deeply human as well. Nature's second chance in Iberá. While jaguars often take the spotlight in Iberá's transformation, they were only one part of a much larger ecological comeback unfolding across the wetlands. As restoration efforts expanded, other species that had once vanished or drastically declined began to reappear, each playing a different role in rebuilding the ecosystem's balance. One of the most remarkable recoveries involved the giant anteater. After being heavily impacted by habitat loss and illegal wildlife trade, individuals like Ivotipora, rescued years earlier, helped establish a growing population that eventually reached into the hundreds. By 2022, multiple stable groups had formed, showing that the species was no longer just surviving, but beginning to thrive again. Other mammals also returned to their historical range. Pampas deer slowly re-entered grassland areas, while collared peccaries, absent for decades, were reintroduced and began re-establishing themselves across suitable habitats. These herbivores and omnivores added new layers to the food web, helping restore ecological interactions that had been missing for generations. The recovery wasn't limited to land animals. Birdlife also surged as red and green macaws returned to Iberá's skies, bringing back flashes of color and movement that had been absent since large forest patches were lost. Their presence signaled improving forest conditions and added new energy to the region's biodiversity. In the water, progress was more cautious, but still promising. Giant river otters, once extinct locally, began showing signs of recovery. By 2024, small groups were being monitored in controlled environments, with successful breeding events offering hope that they could soon return fully to the wild. Their comeback hinted at improving aquatic health and food availability in the wetlands. Still, despite all these recoveries, one imbalance remained clear. Without a dominant apex predator shaping behavior, herbivore populations still had the potential to grow beyond sustainable levels. The system was improving, but it was not yet fully stabilized. And that realization pushed conservationists toward an unavoidable conclusion. Partial recovery was not enough. Something essential was still missing from Iberá's ecosystem, and bringing it back would determine whether this revival could truly last or slowly unravel again. When humans became part of the conflict, as jaguars settled back into Iberá, the celebration of ecological recovery came with an uncomfortable reality that couldn't be ignored. For many local communities, especially cattle ranchers, the return of a top predator was not just a scientific milestone, it was a direct threat to their way of life. After decades without jaguars in the region, livestock farming had grown without the need to account for large carnivores, and that sudden change created fear and resistance. The concerns were not purely emotional. In areas where jaguars roam, livestock losses can happen, and even isolated incidents are enough to create widespread anxiety among farmers who depend on cattle for income. For communities already facing economic pressure, the idea of reintroducing a powerful predator weighing over 200 pounds felt like an unnecessary risk imposed from outside forces. At first, distrust shaped the response, with some landowners suspicious of conservation efforts and worried about their livelihoods. Reports of predation fueled opposition, and tensions with ranchers grew, threatening restoration. Leaders realized recovery needed people too, so they engaged communities through education, dialogue, and incentives to support coexistence. A major turning point was ecotourism. As wildlife returned, visitors came to see jaguars, macaws, and rare species, creating new jobs in guiding, transport, hospitality, and research. Former hunters became wildlife guides, shifting their relationship with the land. However, some conflicts remained, especially over livestock losses, requiring compensation and ongoing negotiation. The challenge in Iberá was no longer just about bringing animals back. It was about keeping both people and predators on the same land without pushing either out. And as the system tried to stabilize under this fragile balance, a new and unpredictable force was about to test everything that had been rebuilt. When fire hit the rewilded paradise, just when Iberá seemed to be finding its balance again, nature delivered a new and brutal challenge that no one could ignore. In 2022, a massive wildfire outbreak swept across Corrientes province, fueled by extreme drought, record heat, and relentless winds. What was once a thriving wetland system turned, in many places, into a dry and burning landscape. The destruction was enormous, affecting millions of acres across the region, including severe damage within Iberá National Park. Large sections of recently restored grasslands and habitats were hit, putting fragile recovery efforts at risk again and raising concerns about their long-term stability. Wildlife was driven into survival mode as capybaras, deer, birds, and jaguars moved out of their usual ranges in search of water and shelter. Conservation teams responded quickly, deploying boats, drones, and field monitoring to track animals, rescue the injured, and safeguard remaining refugee zones. The fires revealed a harsh truth. Ecological recovery cannot escape climate pressure. Years of restoration can be undone in days when extreme weather strikes. Iberá's revival exists in a climate-uncertain world. Yet after the destruction, many species survived, adapted, and even reproduced. Jaguars were still recorded breeding, showing the population persisted. By 2024, monitoring data showed continued growth, with more jaguar births recorded and a slowly expanding population spread across the wetlands. It was not a full recovery from the fire, but it was a sign that the system was not breaking as easily as feared. As the smoke cleared and regeneration began again, Iberá entered a new phase of resilience testing, one where survival was no longer just about restoration, but endurance. And from that fragile recovery, a new opportunity was beginning to take shape, turning this reborn wilderness into something the world had never seen before. Iberá's transformation into a living legacy. As Iberá's wildlife returned and stabilized, something equally important began to shift on the human side: how people made a living from the land itself. What was once dominated by cattle ranching and land degradation slowly started evolving into a new kind of economy built around living nature instead of exploiting it. Ecotourism quickly became one of the strongest drivers of change. Visitors from around the world began arriving to witness jaguars moving through the wetlands, giant anteaters roaming grasslands, and macaws flying over restored forests. Iberá was no longer just a remote ecosystem. It had become a global destination for conservation in action. This new interest created opportunities that didn't exist before. Former ranch workers and hunters became wildlife guides, boat operators, rangers, and lodge staff, with livelihoods now tied to protecting wildlife. Jaguars turned from feared predators into a tourist draw. Investments in infrastructure and ecotourism helped local families benefit, shifting perceptions of the wetlands. International attention further boosted funding, research, and global awareness. Perhaps the most striking change was the shift in how jaguars were perceived. Once seen as dangerous threats to livestock, they gradually became symbols of pride, protection, and opportunity. Their return signaled not just ecological success, but a new identity for the entire region. Still, the future of Iberá remains delicate. Climate pressure, human conflict, and environmental uncertainty continue to shape its path forward. But what Iberá proves is that restoration is no longer just about saving nature. It is about rebuilding entire relationships between people and the wild. And as this transformed landscape continues to evolve, Iberá now stands as a living question to the world. If a lost predator can return and rebuild an ecosystem, what else might still be possible elsewhere? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Stay tuned for more incredible real-life nature transformations, and we'll see you in the next video.